There is a mark on my front gate this morning. Fresh cut, clean edges, made sometime before dawn. I know exactly what it means. I've been a hunter for 20 years, tracking game through some of the most remote wilderness in Oregon. I thought I knew everything that lived in these mountains. I was wrong. The elk was enormous. I spotted him from the ridge just after 6 in the morning, standing in the clearing below, like he owned every acre of the Cascade Range, which, honestly, he probably did. 12 points, maybe 14. The kind of rack you see once in a decade if you're lucky and patient and willing to spend a week in the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays there. I'd been tracking him for 3 days. 3 days of freeze-dried meals and wet socks, and sleeping on ground that never quite leveled out, no matter how many times you repositioned your sleeping pad. I'm not a young man anymore. 42 years old, 2 tours in the Pacific Northwest wilderness with search and rescue before I transitioned into private contracting. And before that, 8 years in the Army, where I learned that discomfort was just a state of mind you could choose to override. My body disagreed with that philosophy more often these days, but the mind still won most arguments. The morning was the kind of quiet that Oregon does better than anywhere else I've ever been. Not the absence of sound, but a specific quality of silence that feels intentional, like the forest is holding something in. The Douglas firs stretched up on either side of the valley, 200 feet tall and older than the country, and the mist was sitting low in the hollow where the creek ran, soft and gray and completely still. I'd been in position on that ridge for 90 minutes before the elk stepped out, and in all that time, I hadn't heard anything except the occasional drip of condensation falling from a branch somewhere above me. My rifle was up, cheek on the stock, crosshairs on the elk's shoulder. Perfect shot. Clean kill. Everything I'd come here for. I didn't take it. I'm still not entirely sure why. I've thought about it a lot in the weeks since. There was no logical reason to hesitate. The elk was broadside at 200 yards, no wind, no obstructions. I've made harder shots in worse conditions without a second thought. But something made me lower the rifle, just slightly, and scan the tree line on the far side of the clearing. The tree line was empty. Of course it was, just trees. I chalked it up to tiredness and raised the rifle again. But the elk had already moved, stepping back into the shadow of the firs like he sensed something I couldn't. Maybe he had. Animals read the landscape better than we do. We've just convinced ourselves otherwise. I ate a cold breakfast on the ridge and studied my map. I was 3 miles from the nearest logging road and about 7 miles from where I'd parked my truck. The area I was in wasn't technically restricted, but it wasn't popular either. The terrain was difficult, and the access routes were poor, which suited me fine. I'd found the location through old topographical surveys and a conversation with a retired Forest Service ranger who described it as, quote, genuinely unpleasant country, end quote, which in my experience means nobody goes there. Nobody except me, apparently. I repacked my kit and started working my way down toward the valley floor, planning to follow the creek north and pick up the elk's trail where it crossed the water. I moved slowly, the way you learn to move when you've spent enough time in the field. No sudden changes of direction. Weight transferred heel to toe. Pause every 20 steps and listen. It was on one of those pauses, about halfway down the slope, that I noticed the tree. It was a large fir, maybe 6 feet in diameter at the base, and it had been marked. Not by a bear, which was my first thought. Bears claw vertically, shredding bark in long downward strips. And the marks are irregular because bears are working for something specific, insects or sap. These marks were different. They were deliberate horizontal cuts, 4 of them, evenly spaced, placed at a height of about 9 feet from the ground. The cuts went maybe 2 inches deep into the wood, and they were clean-edged, not torn. Whatever made them had done it with precision and force. I looked at the mark for a long time. Then I took a photo with my phone, noted the GPS coordinates in my field log, and continued down the slope. I didn't think about it again until much later. That's the thing about significant details. They sit quietly in the back of your mind, waiting for context. I found the elk's tracks crossing the creek just where I expected them. Size, 13 inches, deep impressions, moving fast. He'd been spooked by something, though I couldn't tell what. I noted which direction he'd gone, decided the tracking could wait, and set up camp in a sheltered spot against a granite outcropping where the rock would hold what little warmth there was. That night, I slept badly. Not because of the cold or the ground or the usual discomforts. I slept badly because sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up with the absolute certainty that something very large was standing 20 feet from my tent, completely still, in the dark. I lay there with my hand on the rifle for 11 minutes. I counted. Nothing moved. No sound. No smell. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing there. But in the soft ground, just at the edge of my camp light, there was a footprint. A single impression, 18 inches long, that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I pressed my own boot next to it. Mine disappeared inside it. I'm not the kind of man who jumps to conclusions. That's not modesty, it's just accurate. The Army trained me to gather information before forming assessments, and 2 decades of working in wilderness environments reinforced that habit. So when I found the footprint that morning, I did not think what most people would think. I measured it. I photographed it from 4 angles. I noted the depth of the impression relative to my own boot print and estimated a body weight of somewhere between 600 and 900 pounds, accounting for variables in soil density. I looked for secondary prints and found none, which either meant the ground was too hard beyond that single soft patch, or the thing, whatever it was, had been careful. Then I had coffee and thought about it rationally. Large footprints in the Pacific Northwest get attributed to Bigfoot approximately 10,000 times a year and are almost always explainable. Distorted bear prints when a bear steps in its own front track with its rear foot. Human hoaxing. Compression distortion from freeze and thaw cycles. I ran through all of these possibilities while I drank my coffee and watched the mist lift off the creek below. By the time I'd finished eating, I had landed on soil distortion plus some kind of large ungulate as the most probable explanation. I packed up camp and went looking for the elk. I found something else. The valley narrowed about 2 miles north of my camp. The creek squeezed between 2 steep slopes covered in old-growth fir, and it opened again into a natural bowl, maybe 300 yards across. There was a lake at the center of it, small and perfectly still, fed by snowmelt from the ridge above. The kind of lake that doesn't appear on most maps because it's too small and too far from anything to matter to anyone. The water was the color of dark glass, and the firs came down to within 10 feet of the bank on 3 sides. I came over the lip of the bowl just after 8 in the morning and stopped. There were 4 of them at the lake's edge. 3 on the far bank, partially screened by brush, and 1 partially in the water, standing in the shallows at the north end. My first instinct was bear, specifically black bears, which are common in this part of Oregon, and which, when they stand upright to investigate something, can briefly look almost bipedal. I raised my binoculars. They were not bears. They were standing fully upright, consistently, without the side-to-side sway and the forward lean that defines a bear's bipedal stance. Their legs were long and articulated in the right proportions, knees bending in the correct direction, weight distributed the way a biped distributes weight, over the hips, not the shoulders. The one in the water was the largest, and I estimated its height at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet. The others were smaller. 2 of them were juveniles. I could tell from their proportions, the slightly larger heads, the less defined musculature, the way they moved with that particular combination of energy and uncertainty that is universal to young animals of any species. I was behind a low ridge of granite with natural cover on both sides, and I stayed completely still. The binoculars were steady. My breathing was controlled. Years of hunting and fieldwork take over in moments like that, and the rational mind catches up to the body later. The large one in the water was fishing. Not with any tool, but with a technique so refined it was clearly learned rather than instinctual. It stood with almost no movement at all, weight slightly forward, hands just under the surface of the water. And the stillness of it was striking, because nothing that large should be able to hold that quality of stillness. Then, without any visible build-up or telegraphing, it struck. Both hands came together and came up with a fish, a large trout from the size of it, that it carried to the bank and set down with the others. One of the juveniles grabbed the fish immediately. The large one made a sound I felt rather than heard, a low vibration that reached me even at 150 yards, and the juvenile put the fish down and stepped back. A correction, clear, proportionate, and immediately effective. The smaller adult, and I say adult based on relative size and the way it moved with a certain settled confidence, took the fish and crouched down near the juveniles. It began demonstrating something to them using the fish and a flat rock. The motion was deliberate and instructional. It was showing them something. I watched for 40 minutes without moving. In that 40 minutes, the large one caught 7 fish and delivered each one to the bank. The smaller adult continued what I can only describe as a lesson, guiding the juveniles through a series of actions with patient repetition. One juvenile attempted to enter the water and fish on its own. It was unsuccessful repeatedly, and each failure was met not with correction, but with what appeared to be encouragement, a sound and a touch, before the attempt was made again. The other juvenile found a piece of quartz in the shallows and brought it to the smaller adult. The adult examined it carefully, held it up to the light, then handed it back. Then the juvenile brought it to the large one, who examined it the same way and handed it back as well. The juvenile carried it to the bank and set it with apparent care in a specific spot on a flat rock, deliberately set aside, kept. I had my phone out and was filming, though at that distance the footage would be nearly useless. But I needed something. I needed some kind of record, because my rational mind was fighting a sustained rearguard action against what my eyes were showing me, and I needed ballast. That was when the large one turned and looked directly at me. Not in my general direction, directly at me. The binoculars were between us, but I felt it the same way you feel it when a large predator locks onto you in the field. A change in the air. A shift in some atmospheric quality you can't name, but your nervous system has been responding to since before you had language for it. The hair on my forearms lifted. My stomach dropped about 3 inches. The large one stared at my position for 10 seconds. 20. The rest of the group went still. Then it looked away and returned to the water. My hands were shaking when I lowered the binoculars. Not badly, but enough that I noticed. I noticed because my hands haven't shaken in the field since my second deployment, and even then it was only once, and I've spent 20 years being quietly proud of that fact. The shaking lasted until I made a fist and held it for a count of 10. When I looked back through the binoculars, all 4 of them were gone. The lake sat empty and perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky, and there was no indication that anything had ever been there except for the fish on the flat rock and the piece of quartz sitting apart from them, set aside with care. I moved position immediately. Faster than was quiet, but I needed distance between myself and the lake while I processed what I'd seen. I went up the east slope, found a dense stand of young firs that gave me cover from 3 directions, and sat with my back against a tree and ran through it. Not Bigfoot. I don't use that word, even in my own head. That word carries 30 years of blurry photographs and carnival hoaxes and cable television specials designed to sell advertising. What I'd seen at the lake didn't belong in that category. What I'd seen at the lake was something I needed a different framework for entirely, and I didn't have one ready. The lesson at the bank, the corrected juvenile, the quartz, set aside with intention. I thought about the marked tree I'd found the day before. The horizontal cuts at 9 feet, evenly spaced, made with precision, not territorial marking in the animal sense, something more deliberate than that. I thought about the footprint outside my tent. I pulled out my field notebook and started writing. Date, time, location, physical description of all 4 individuals, behavioral observations in sequence. I wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, trying to get everything down before memory started editing it. That's another thing the military teaches you. Document immediately, because the mind is not a reliable archive, and it will begin revising your experience within hours to fit the frameworks you already have. When I finished writing, I sat and looked at the notebook for a long time. Then I made a decision that went against every rational instinct I had. I went back. Not to the lake shore. I circled around to the north, staying high on the slope, using the tree line for cover, and came back into the bowl from a different angle that gave me a position above and behind where I'd been before, with better concealment and a longer sight line across the water. They were already back. All 4 of them, plus 1 more. A 5th individual, larger than the juveniles, but smaller than the primary male, standing at the edge of the tree line on the far bank in a way that suggested it had been there for a while. Watching the spot where I'd been. The smaller adult, the one I'd started thinking of as the teacher, was crouched near the flat rock. It was doing something with its hands that I couldn't fully make out at this distance. I adjusted position very slowly, moving about 15 feet to the left over the course of 5 minutes, and got a clearer angle. It was making marks. On the flat surface of the rock, using a piece of harder stone, it was scratching lines. I could see the motion clearly, deliberate strokes, repeated, checked. The large male crouched nearby, watching. The juveniles had moved away and were occupied with something in the shallows. I was looking at what appeared to be, and I am choosing my words with absolute care here, a diagram. Lines that suggested terrain, curves that could have been contours, a specific mark near what might have been the lake itself. I could not confirm the details at that distance, but the process of making it was unmistakable. Sustained concentration, revision, reference to the surroundings as if checking the representation against the reality. The 5th individual at the tree line turned its head and looked at the slope above and to my left, not at me, but close. It was scanning methodically, moving its gaze in a pattern that covered the entire upper rim of the bowl. I understood then, with complete clarity, that whatever these beings were, they were not operating on instinct. They were aware of their environment in the way that planning intelligence is aware of its environment. They were considering variables. They were taking precautions. And one of them had been outside my tent. I started backing up the slope, slow and controlled, keeping my center of gravity low. I'd gone about 30 feet when I heard the sound. Not a vocalization, a movement, something large and unhurried, shifting position in the trees to my right, maybe 40 feet away, just inside the tree line where the shadows were thick enough to hide almost anything. I stopped. The movement stopped. I waited 60 seconds by my internal count, and then turned my head very slowly to look at the trees. She was standing about 35 feet away, partially behind a fir, with a trunk wide enough to hide most of her body, and she was looking at me with an expression I had no framework for, but recognized anyway. Not aggression, not fear, something more considered than either of those things. She was tall, nearly as tall as the male, with a broader, more upright posture than I'd expected, and her eyes were dark and set well forward in her face, and they were moving over me in a way that was not the way an animal looks at something new. It was the way a person looks at something they've been thinking about. She had been watching me watch them. I didn't run. That surprised me afterward. Every trained reflex I had said that if you encounter a large, unknown primate at 35 feet and it's between you and your exit route, you make yourself look large, you speak in a firm, low voice, and you back away slowly without turning your back. What I actually did was stand completely still and hold eye contact. I don't know why. Maybe because she hadn't moved. Maybe because the quality of her attention was so manifestly not predatory that my body registered it before my brain did. We stayed like that for a time I couldn't measure accurately, long enough for the cold to work its way through my jacket again, long enough for me to hear the creak below and the distant call of something in the upper firs. She didn't blink with any regularity I could track. Her hands, resting at her sides, were relaxed. Then she stepped out from behind the tree. She crossed the distance between us in 4 unhurried strides and stopped 8 feet away. This close, the scale of her was difficult to process. She was looking at my face, specifically at my eyes, in a direct and sustained way that nothing wild does. Wild animals assess threat vectors. They look at your hands and your posture and the angle of your body. She was looking at my eyes. She made a sound. Not a vocalization in the animal sense, but a series of 3 distinct low tones, each one slightly different in pitch, with a pause between each one. Then she waited. I said, without thinking about it, "I'm not armed," which was a lie. The rifle was on my back, but I'd meant it as a declaration of intent, and apparently something in my tone communicated that, because she made a single different sound and tilted her head very slightly to the right. She turned and walked toward the bowl, then stopped and looked back at me. I followed her. The walk down to the lake took about 10 minutes, and she moved in a way that seemed calibrated to my pace, which was slower than hers would naturally have been. When I stumbled once on loose shale, she paused without turning around and waited for me to regain my footing. And that small act of patience was more disorienting than anything else that had happened so far, because it implied she had a model of me that included my limitations. The others registered my arrival in different ways. The male stood and oriented toward me immediately, his full mass suddenly very present in the space, and I felt my body respond to that before I could override it. But she made a sound toward him, and he sat again, not casually, but with deliberateness, a choice to sit rather than a retreat. The 5th individual, the one who'd been watching the slope, moved to the far side of the camp and stayed there. The juveniles were a different matter entirely. They retreated behind the male at first, peering around him with the specific combination of terror and curiosity that is apparently universal in young things, regardless of species. Within about 20 minutes, one of them had crept to within 15 feet of me and was studying my gear with an intensity that would have been funny in other circumstances. She sat across the fire from me, and yes, they had a fire, built in a cleared space with rocks arranged in a circle, and a specific type of layered tinder I'd only seen in structured survival training. And she watched me with that same steady attention she'd used in the forest. Every time I moved, she tracked the movement. Not with alarm, but with the quality of attention you give to something you're trying to understand. I took off my gloves, slowly, and set them on the ground between us. She looked at the gloves for a long moment. Then she reached out with one hand and touched one with the very tips of her fingers, feeling the texture of the synthetic material, the seam along the side, the Velcro strap at the wrist. She pressed the palm of her hand flat against it and held it there. Then she sat back and made a sound to the juvenile who had come closest. The juvenile approached, slowly, looked at me to confirm I was not going to move, and picked up one of the gloves. It examined it with the same thoroughness she had used, working through the details in sequence rather than randomly. I held out my bare hand. The juvenile looked at the glove, then at my hand, then at its own, much larger hand. It placed the glove carefully on the ground, reached out, and pressed its palm to mine. Comparing. It made a sound that the male responded to from across the fire, and the female responded to as well, and whatever it communicated caused something to shift in the atmosphere of the group that I felt but couldn't precisely define. A reduction in tension, an agreement of some kind. That night the temperature dropped hard, and I was cold in a way my jacket wasn't equipped for. She noticed, the way she seemed to notice everything about me, and disappeared into the tree line for a period of about 15 minutes. She returned with a folded mass of something dry, bark and dry moss layered together, and set it near me without ceremony. I used it as insulation against the ground, and the difference was significant. Later, when the fire had settled to steady coals and the juveniles were still in the shelter, she moved around to my side of the fire and sat a few feet away, and for a long time, neither of us did anything except exist in the same space. The male was awake across the fire, watching the dark perimeter with the relaxed alertness of something that never fully powers down. At some point, the closer juvenile came out of the shelter and sat near me, wrapped one hand lightly around my forearm, and fell asleep like that. I didn't move. I watched the fire and the dark beyond it, and the slow movement of the male's head as he worked through the sounds the forest was making. At some point, I fell asleep too. I dreamed about the marked tree. In the dream, the marks were not cuts in the wood. They were letters in a language I almost recognized. I woke before dawn to the sound of something being set down near my head. Very deliberate. The sound of something being placed, not dropped. She was crouched beside me, and between us, on the flat surface of a piece of dark bark, was a mark. She'd made it with a piece of charcoal from the fire edge, and it was a shape I recognized after a moment as a simplified overhead view of the bowl with the lake at its center. She'd indicated the lake with a curved mark and the slopes with angular lines that correctly represented the steepness gradient I'd navigated coming down. She'd marked the position of the camp with a small, dense cluster of marks, and she had marked, with a single, precise dot, the location on the upper slope where I had been watching them. I looked at her. She pointed at the dot on the bark, then at me. Looked at me with that sustained eye contact. Then she pointed at the camp mark, then at herself. She knew, had known, had been aware of my position, potentially from the beginning. She made 2 more marks on the bark, a line leading north from the bowl. At the end of the line, a different kind of mark, repeated twice, a specific shape I didn't immediately understand. Then the juvenile, the bolder one, who had come awake and was watching this, reached into a fold in the shelter material and produced something. My compass. Not my compass. An exact duplicate of my compass, down to the manufacturer's design on the bezel. In fact, almost certainly my compass, which I had last seen clipped to my pack. The juvenile turned it over in its hands, opened the cover, watched the needle settle, turned the compass, watched the needle settle again. Then it pointed the compass toward the north mark on the bark. I felt the cold moving up through the ground into my spine, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. The compass was not novel to the juvenile. The juvenile knew what it was. The juvenile understood the relationship between the compass and the marks on the bark and the landscape around us. The juvenile had taken my compass and worked out its function, and was now using it to read a map. She had drawn a map, with contour indicators and location marks, and a directional reference. She was watching me understand this, and the quality of her attention in that moment was different from anything I'd seen in her so far. There was something in it that was almost like expectation. I picked up the charcoal from the bark edge and drew what she'd drawn: north line, bowl, lake, camp, and then I drew the ridge I'd approached from, and then I drew the logging road to the south, and my truck, indicated by a rough rectangle. She looked at what I'd drawn for a long time. Then she added 2 more marks to the north of her original line, and they were marks I recognized. They were the same marks as the horizontal cuts in the tree I'd photographed on the first day. She looked at me, pointed north, made a sustained, low sound that the male answered from across the clearing without looking over. There were more of them north of here. These were symbols they used to communicate territory or location, or something I didn't have the vocabulary for. And she was showing them to me. Not by accident. Not because I'd stumbled onto something I shouldn't have seen. She was showing me because she had decided to. The male came over and crouched next to the bark map, and the 2 of them had a brief exchange of sounds that was clearly referential. They were discussing something specific. And at one point, she indicated the mark for my truck, and the male looked at me and made a different sound, a single tone, and looked away again. The juvenile was still holding my compass. It looked at me and held it out. I took it, and the juvenile immediately produced from somewhere a rounded stone that had been worked into a flatter, more regular shape than it would have had naturally. The sides of it had been abraded smooth. On one face, scratched with precision, were 3 of the same marks I'd seen on the tree. The juvenile placed it in my hand with a decisiveness that was not the gesture of an animal offering a found object. It was a deliberate exchange. You take the compass back. You take this. She was watching me hold the stone with that expression I still couldn't name, and for the first time since I'd entered the bowl, I felt something close to what I can only describe as vertigo. Not physical, but the specific disorientation that comes when a framework you've relied on for your entire life simply stops being adequate. I had come to this valley looking for an elk. I was sitting at a fire in the pre-dawn dark of the Oregon Cascades, holding a carved and marked stone that had just been handed to me by something that had taken my compass, understood its function, and used it to read a map drawn by someone who already knew where I'd been watching from, before I thought I'd been seen. They had not stumbled into contact with me. I had been brought here.
She walked me out. The whole family came as far as the lip of the bowl and then stopped, except for her, who continued another 100 yards to the base of the eastern slope and then stopped there. The male watched from the bowl's edge.
The juveniles were on either side of him, and the bolder one raised one hand as I looked back. A motion so close to a human wave that my throat did something involuntary and embarrassing. She stood at the slope base and watched me climb. I looked back 4 times. Each time she was still there, still watching, with that quality of attention I'd spent 3 days trying to find a word for and had finally given up on naming. The 5th time I looked back, she was gone. I reached the ridge and stood in the early morning light with the bowl below me and the cascades extending in every direction, and the logging road visible as a pale line about a mile to the south. I stood there for a long time. I am not someone who stands still looking at landscapes. I am someone who moves efficiently toward objectives. That's who I've been for 20 years. Standing still on a ridge looking at nothing is not something I do. I stood there for a long time. The drive out took 2 hours. I drove with the stone in my right hand, on the seat next to my leg, close enough to touch. It was warm from my pocket in a way that stone holds warmth, which is slowly and for a long time. 3 of the marked symbols on its face. I'd photographed it from every angle before I packed out, and the photos were on my phone, and I didn't look at them. My wife was in the kitchen when I got home. She looked at my face the way she looks at things she's decided to approach carefully and said, "You were gone longer than you planned." And I said, "The tracking took longer than expected," and she handed me coffee and watched me hold it. I put the stone on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I see it every morning. I've spent the 6 weeks since I got back going through everything I wrote in the field notebook and cross-referencing it with everything I know about primate cognition, human settlement patterns in the Cascades prior to the 19th century, and Forest Service records of unexplained trail findings in the Central Oregon backcountry. I found 37 documented reports in the last decade of horizontal cut marks at height in old-growth stands between here and the Idaho border. All of them attributed to unknown causation. All of them within 20 miles of lakes that appear on old survey maps, but not modern ones. 37 locations. A pattern that covers an area of roughly 12,000 square miles. Not a family, not even several families. A network, with territory markers and communication systems and deliberate boundaries, and the capacity to study us for as long as they have chosen to, from whatever distance they have determined is appropriate, in whatever locations they have decided to visit. I have not told anyone about this except now, in this way, without details that could lead anyone to that bowl, or that lake, or those people. Which is the word I have settled on, because nothing else is accurate. If you've read this far, and something in it feels true to you, not believable in the way a good story feels believable, but true in the way a thing feels true before you have evidence for it, I want to know. Leave a comment below. Not about whether you believe me. I'm not asking for that. Tell me if you've found marks like the ones I described. Horizontal cuts at height, evenly spaced, in old-growth timber, far from trails. Tell me if you've camped somewhere in the Cascades, or the Olympics, or the Blues, and woken up knowing something large had been near your tent without being able to say why you knew. Tell me if an animal ever looked at you in a way that wasn't an animal looking at you. I've been reading every comment on everything I've posted since I got back, and I'm looking for a specific pattern in the locations people mention. I think the 37 marks I found are not the whole picture. I think the picture is much larger than that, and I think some of you have pieces of it without knowing what you're holding. Subscribe if you want to know what I find. I'm going back to the Forest Service records next week, and I have a contact at a university in Eugene who studies pre-contact territorial markers in the Pacific Northwest and doesn't know yet what I'm going to ask him. I'll report back. I always report back. I am not going back to the bowl, not because I'm afraid of them, because 2 nights ago I was taking out the recycling at 11 at night, and I looked up, and there was something standing at the far end of my street, under the last streetlight, before the road curves into the dark of the park. And it was standing very still, and it was very tall. And when I looked directly at it, it did not move. And when I went inside and looked from the window, it was gone. And this morning, there was a single horizontal mark cut cleanly into the wooden post of my front gate. Fresh wood showing inside the cut. Made last night. They know where I live. They have always known where I live. And the mark on my gate is not a threat. I know that because I have spent 6 weeks learning how they communicate, and what that particular mark means when it appears at the boundary of a space. It means, we see you. It has always meant, we see you. The stone is still warm on the windowsill. I'm looking at it right now.